Good evening, everyone. And I once again thank Overman Foundation for giving me the opportunity to deliver these talks on Sri Aurobindo's The Future Poetry. We had been talking of the power of the spirit in relation to poetry, especially future poetry, and we had discussed how the spirit must affect the form of poetry. In continuation of that, we'll see now how the change in spirit shall bring about a subtle change in the word and rhythmic movement too of poetry. The new spirit obviously cannot be held within the old habits of speech, and so the old patterns must either enlarge or deepen and be transformed, or must be broken up and replaced by other ones. Sri Aurobindo says the poetic word is the vehicle of the spirit, the medium of the soul's self expression. So, when there is a change in the inner habit of the soul, its way of seeing, feeling, when there is a heightening or entry into deeper chambers of its self, it goes without saying that there has to be an accompanying change in the poetic word also, which is the medium of expression. There has to be a similar modification, a corresponding inner greatening and deepening of the word, a change in the intensity of light and power to reflect the new spirit. Without this change, the new intention of the spirit cannot be perfectly expressed. It won't be a living self expression of the spirit. But the problem here is of the conservative human mind, which is averse to any idea of change and modification and poses an obstacle in the way of the transforming force. It is content with and insists on the traditional, established norms and standards of literary perfection. But we have to note that the spirit is eternally self renewing, and if there is no corresponding change in the medium of its self expression, there may eventually come about a decay. The petrifaction caused by the insistence on stability here can be worse than the decadence the purist fears when faced by a strangeness or a distortion of poetic molds of speech, or a departure from enduring rules of perfection, and which may prove to be very risky. Sri Aurobindo further adds that a change of considerable magnitude has been seen at work in recent literary works. And this is due to the fact that there is a turn towards a more intimate and directly or fully intuitive speech in recent writings. But the interesting fact is that those who are making this change, those who are making this intuitive speech and rhythm a means of self expression, are hardly conscious of doing so most of the time. Because it's so subtle a change that it cannot always be envisaged or analyzed. It can better be indicated only. Sri Aurobindo says all poetry is intuitive in its inmost character, except, of course, poetry of the most outward kind, which is hardly any different from prose, except in form. Otherwise, all poetry is more a creation of the vision than of the mere intelligence. And the change that is brought about is of the depth of the self from which the poetic intuition acts. The intervening psychological instrument of the poetic intuition is more responsible for this subtle change rather than the initiating movement. The poetic intuition is somewhat modified in transmission. But Sri Aurobindo says that the initiating inspiration has to be always intuitive, and the form or expression differs according as the intuitive inspiration works in a lesser or a greater way. Speech, which is one of the best and most important means of self expression, becomes an intellectual device when used by the intellect, connoting an object or an idea. But poetic speech is different from this for the poet has to do much more than present an idea precisely or forcefully. According to Sri Aurobindo, a poet must put breath of life to the words he uses and so has to discover and then make full use of its potent power of living suggestion. Thus, poetic speech enters more into the vital reality of the word and reveals the more mystic connection between the movement of the spirit and the significance of the mental utterance. So, when the poet uses a word, it must carry both the intellectual notion and the emotion and also the psychical sensation of the thing he wants to present. It has to be a living image and its presence and appeal such as we can inwardly live with it as with the external object. In Vedic theory, it is said that the spirit created the worlds by the word. And we have touched upon this issue briefly in our earlier talks. So the point is, the poet also creates by his creative word an inner world of beings and objects and experiences, whether fragmentarily or largely or in isolated or masked spaces. Yet, the process of creation remains a mystery. We cannot fathom the secret of the inmost process of creation and can know and analyze only the most outward and mechanical part of it. Similarly, the creative faculty of the poet is an enigma, not fully analyzable by the human intellect. Sri Aurobindo says, and I'm quoting, the poet is a magician who hardly knows the secret of his own spell. Even the part taken by the consciously critical or constructive mind is less intellectual than intuitive. He creates by an afflatus of spiritual power of which his mind is the channel and instrument, and the appreciation of it in himself and others comes not by an intellectual judgment but by a spiritual feeling. Unquote. So it is that spiritual thing which guides the poet, whether the word he uses expresses the true body of his vision, or whether he must seek for another word which shall be more effective and adequately reflect his vision and be the inspired and inevitable utterance. So, as there is a difference between ordinary or intellectual speech and poetic speech, as we have just mentioned, so also the intuitive speech of poetry itself has various powers. And Sri Aurobindo draws the distinction between these, although this can again better be felt than critically stated. But there are certain indications which may help to sense the different types of poetic speech by the critical intelligence. So let us now see what are the different powers and styles of poetic speech as explained by Sri Aurobindo. Words, as we use them, seem to be mere physical sounds at their most external. The mind has made these to represent certain objects and ideas. It is a kind of a system. Words and their uses and sounds are machinery which is perhaps nervous in origin, but developed by the intelligence for finer and more intricate use. Now, if we look behind these mere externals and into their inmost psychological aspect, we shall see that it is a subtle conscious force to which the speech owes its life and appeal and significance. It is what Sri Aurobindo explains as the soul of the body of sound. And in the book, he writes, and I'm quoting, It is a superconscient nature force, raising its material out of our subconscious, but growingly conscious in its operations in the human mind that develops itself in one fundamental way and yet variously in language. Unquote. This force, this power was called Vak by Vedic thinkers who took it to be the goddess of creative speech. The Tantric philosophers also recognized this Shakti and held that it acts in us through different subtle nervous centers on higher and higher levels of its force. The word has different levels of its expressive powers. So, and we have briefly talked about words also in our earlier talks. Today, let us see how this idea of the different levels and degrees of the force of speech can be accepted as a clue of great utility and one of the grades of tantric classification, that is the seeing word, Pashyanti. So let us discuss in brief what this seeing speech is before we follow Sri Aurobindo in his explanation of the different grades of its power and expression. So the seeing word is original and native to the poetic expression, and it is to this level that the poetic mind must elevate itself. Now, prose speech mainly deals with explaining things to the conceptual intelligence, but not so with poetic speech, which sees and presents to a subtle perception in the mind the truth of soul and thought experience and sense and life and the living and spiritual actuality of idea and object. Even if the prose writer uses seeing speech and the poet mixes the speech with intellectual thought, the two kinds still do not become the same. The fundamental difference between prosaic and poetic speech exists, and it is according to Sri Aurobindo that ordinary speech proceeds from and appeals to the conceiving intelligence, while it is the seeing mind that is the master of the poetic utterance. So, now for the different grades of the poetic speech, the seeing speech. The first level is that of the simple and clear poetic adequacy. This is in itself a very low level and at its lowest almost indistinguishable from prose. But in poetry, it is more compact and keeps itself distinct from prose by its force of presentation and the rhythm which brings in a living appeal. It also adds its own emotional and sensational nearness to the expression which would otherwise remain only intellectual. But where there is a finer clarity in this manner of speech, a certain lucidity of vision accompanies the adequate style, and the object or the idea can be seen in that lucidity. Sri Aurobindo himself has quoted from several literary works to exemplify and explain what he means by these different styles. At its simplest, the adequate style may be something like these lines from the poet Dryden, where he writes, "Whatever he did was done with so much ease, in him alone it was natural to please." A bit higher level of the adequate speech makes the poet utter words like these: "The waves beside them danced, but they outdid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such a jocund company." So the difference between the two is quite obvious for any detailed explanation. Dryden's lines sound more prosaic, but remain in the realm of the poetic by a certain vividness and rhythmic suggestion. but he still remains in the borderland. Whereas Wordsworth is away from this borderland definitely, yet in the lines quoted above, hardly very far away from a strong poetical adequacy. So Wordsworth manages to touch and evoke some response of the soul and employs the seeing speech in a better way, which rings with a greater and profounder spiritual sincerity than that of the intelligence. So that is about the adequate style, the adequacy of poetic speech. The second power of seeing speech is what Sri Aurobindo terms the dynamic style, which is more effective and evidently goes beyond the lucid adequate style, as it attempts a richer and more powerful expression. This kind of style is employed by prose writers too sometimes. And here again, Sri Aurobindo explains the difference between the dynamic prose style and the poetic style. At the lower levels, in prosaic works, it is reflected in the use of rhetorics, which the writer employs for greater effects and which mainly appeals to the intelligence. But in a more deep and sincere mood, there is seen a greater aptness and vividness and beauty of phrase arrived at by subtler means. In poetry, also, we find almost the same method but in a different manner. For instance, we have ample of rhetorical speech in poetry, and just that little touch of rhythmic emotion and vision helps to draw the line between poetic rhetoric and that of prose. Sri Aurobindo gives us example some lines from Pope's poem, and I'm quoting the lines: atoms and systems into ruins hurled, and now a bubble burst, and now a world. So now compare this with the following lines of Milton's poetry with a sublimer rhetoric and displaying less of intellectual and more of imaginative sincerity and higher thought and vision. So these are lines from Milton's epic. Hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky, with hideous ruin and combustion down to bottomless perdition. So Sri Aurobindo says there is another rhetorical method which helps the poet achieve a truer and richer poetic effectivity. And this is done by richness and beauty of phrase or the forceful word which makes visible the body of the thought with a living distinctness. And the rhetorical figures are more vivid here. Okay, so for example, we have these lines: her eyes as stars of twilight fair, like twilight's to her dusky hair, but all things else about her drawn from Maytime and the cheerful dawn. So obviously these lines are from Wordsworth, and Sri Aurobindo has given a few more similar examples. So as he says, English poetry is opulent and gets its energy and power from this. In a letter elsewhere, Sri Aurobindo had written that at the dynamic plane of vision, one creates by sight, which is a very vivid and occult sight, seeing the thing behind the veil. But this is still not the highest level. There are higher grades, and the poetic speech is capable of more intimate vision and more penetrating spiritual emotion and more intense revealing speech, according to Sri Aurobindo. And this can be attained when the adequate or the dynamic style can be raised into a greater illumination. This comes about when it is the inner mind which sees the objects or feels the emotion clearly and powerfully. Sometimes there is a flash or outbreak of transforming light, which leads the thought or image to a new significance of a more inner character and profoundly revealing vision. This is what is called the illuminating style. The poet may suddenly come upon this power, as sometimes we find an illuminating line in the midst of other poetic styles, as, say, this line from Dryden, and paradise was opened in his face. So it is rather a rare occurrence. Or it may be an intervening occurrence, as in these lines from Shelley, where the force of image and feeling passes beyond mere effectivity and into an illuminative closeness, to use Sri Aurobindo's words. And listen to these lines quoted by Sri Aurobindo himself. The heart's echoes render no song when the spirit is mute, no song but sad dirges like the wind through a ruined cell. In reading lines like these, we live almost the experience through the power of the poetic word. Sometimes it emerges from the lucid, adequate style in luminous words and phrases with profound suggestion of meaning. Sometimes it comes in the midst of strong and effective poetical thinking, a line or a phrase perhaps. At other times, the illuminating seeing speech leaps up at once, Sri Aurobindo says, and sets the tone of a poem. For instance, these lines: She was a phantom of delight when first she gleamed upon my sight, a lovely apparition sent to be a moment's ornament. And as examples of pure illuminative speech which does not arise out of the lower adequate or dynamic styles, but is unalloyed and changed into a supra intellectual light of intuitive substance and vision, Sri Aurobindo quotes from Wordsworth these lines: They flash upon the inner eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So there is an increased intensity and purity of the language of intuitive expression. All poetry exhibits something of the power of the spirit in varying measures, and only the least inspired poetry can be purely intellectual in substance. The intuitive mind suggests the thing to be conveyed in almost all instances, but when the style is less intense, the suggestion of the intuitive mind does not find a direct or undiluted expression. The intellectualized language or the imagination intervenes and tries to bridge the gap between the intuitive mind and normal intelligence. Actually, these are the two powers, intuition and intelligence, which make for much difference in styles. But these two powers support each other and even fuse and merge at a certain point, which helps the expression of the pure intuitive vision without the barrier of the mind. And this barrier, when crossed, brings in word of intense light with almost complete disregard of the intellect and the imagination. The language of the mind undergoes an unanalyzable alchemy. This is where we get intuitive speech at the basic level. Beyond this, there are more uplifted ranges of inspired speech, the characteristics of which are pure light, beauty, and depth, and greater moved ecstasy of the highest, largest thought and sight and speech. At the highest level, it culminates in this inevitable, absolute, and revealing word. This intuitive speech can be arrived at in several ways. For instance, in the following lines, Wordsworth achieves this by a magical change. And listen to Wordsworth. A voice so thrilling never was heard in springtime from the cuckoo bird, breaking the silence of the seas upon the furthest Hebrides. Sometimes the dynamic style undergoes such transformation, and we have lines like these produced exemplifying the inspired speech. And here are the lines: flowers laugh before thee in their beds, and fragrance in thy footing treads. Thou dost preserve the stars from wrong, and the most ancient heavens through thee are fresh and strong. And when the illuminative speech is inspired to reach the higher level, the revealing word is uttered, as in these lines: the cataracts blow their trumpets from the steep. No more shall grief of mine the season wrong. I hear the echoes through the mountains throng. The winds come to me from the fields of sleep. So here again, I remind my audience that I'm quoting the lines selected by Sri Aurobindo himself as illustrations of the different styles. Now, this is not very usual with Sri Aurobindo, but he has quoted these lines, so it is better to follow him in our initial comprehension of the topic. So, the examples we have given here are meant to show how inspiration has worked to produce the speech of sight, combining the effort of the poetic intelligence and imagination and transmuting them. And when at its highest power, it goes even beyond itself, beyond any touch of the intellect, and into a pure revelatory spiritual vision. Sri Aurobindo says that the poetic genius can create things of great beauty from any of these planes. But the rarest and most difficult to work with is the purely intuitive, inspired, revelatory utterance. And it is these that are really valuable, as it is their power that moves us and admits the soul to a spiritually profound light of seeing and ecstasy of feeling. And this holds even when the poet is speaking of the most ordinary things. And in its highest workings, it takes us to things that exceed all limits of the depth of the normal intelligence. That is the force of the intuitive speech. In one of his letters, Sri Aurobindo had written that the intuitive mind stretches from intuition down to the intuitivized inner mind. That is the range of the intuitive style of speech. In great poets, we find frequent occurrence of this intuitive, inspired speech. And Sri Aurobindo says, in poets like Shakespeare, there is a miraculous abundance of inspired speech. However, there is a variation here, and intuitive speech may differ from poet to poet according to what Sri Aurobindo calls the object vision and the subjective vision. In most poets, some from whom we have quoted here, the poetic intelligence and its imagination are seen to be at work. It is the same power which but takes on a different color and texture in poets who put more of the life soul in their works. So, to explain the difference between this and the work of the intellectualized intuition, Sri Aurobindo gives an example from Shakespeare, and which I am quoting. The Shakespeare writes Claudio's speech. But to die and go we know not where, to lie in cold obstruction and to rot, this sensible warm motion to become a kneaded clot, and the delighted spirit to bathe in fiery floods, or to reside in thrilling region of thick-ribbed ice, to be imprisoned in the viewless winds and blown with restless violence round about the pendant world. In this speech and the thought that is behind it, we feel the intuitive intensity of the life spirit. Even ideas which belong to the thinking intelligence have this kind of inspiration in the works of poets like Shakespeare. And Sri Aurobindo gives two examples, one from Shakespeare again and another from Shelley. So I'm quoting Shakespeare first. Life's but a walking shadow. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. So, very famous lines from his play Macbeth. And now listen to Shelley, who also writes about transience, but in this way: Heaven's light forever shines, earth's shadows fly. Life, like a dome of many colored glass, stains the white radiance of eternity until death tramples it to fragments. How very beautiful, how truly inspired words are these. And in both poets, there is the inspired utterance, but one is more dyed in the intuition of the life soul, and we feel the thought, and the other is the projection of an idea of intelligence uttered in an inspired and illuminating language. But today we cannot write and create in the same essential manner. We cannot recover the same spirit which informed the thought and language of these poets. Sri Aurobindo says Shakespeare's speech is more akin to that of the later poets who wrote out of the intuitive mind or moved poetic intelligence. But Sri Aurobindo also gives us hope that in future poets may yet recover something of the Shakespearean manner when they can take up the thought and feeling and transform them into a concentrated expression of an equal directness. And this will be from the intuitive mind, which will assimilate and absorb all intellectual tones into the closeness of a supra intellectual light and anand. Thus, Sri Aurobindo promises a great future for poetry. So, before we dwell more on the features of future poetry, let us first see what are the most common features and trends of recent poetry, that is, poetry of the time when Sri Aurobindo was writing. And he says, the poet attempts to gain access to the hidden cavern and to express in language of the intuitive self. In continental poetry, also, this search for intuitive force is evident, and also for the more vital experiences and relations with others. The spirit's sense, externalized, and the inner meaning of this externality illumined is the source and motive of recent poetry. English poetry also moves in the same direction, but Sri Aurobindo says with less subtlety and more forceful outwardness. The Irish poets and some Indian poets writing in English were moved by the endeavor of the fundamental time spirit, though their works differ on many accounts. Poets like Rabindranath Tagore, Sarojini Naidu, and contemporary Irish poets search for the intuitivities, life vision, and aim at a psychic or spiritualized imagination and intelligence. So we have quoted from their works also in our earlier talks. So, though these poets aimed high, they were faced with the difficulty of finding the proper intuitive language which could express their vision and make their endeavor successful. The light, the subtlety, the depth, and intensity sought for by the intuition get diluted due to old habits of poetic speech which still cling around their utterance. But there is already a basis for the more illumined poetic style of the future. Sometimes in greater poets is seen an admixture of older methods, and manifests in the new manner of speech the characteristic note of the intuitive style. And with the greatening and deepening of this, and also making this speech normal, the perfect kind of poetry will be created in the future. The aim of the poet will be to express the inner truth of things, and so he has to express it also in the inmost way. And he can do that only by voicing the language of the intuitive mind, intuitive sense and emotion, and vital feeling, which can seize the inmost thought and sense and feeling of that which he has to say. And this comes by a spiritual identity. Obviously, for this, the poet must transcend the more intellectualized and externalized mind and expression, and the mind must be touched by the supramental and invaded by a superior power. The impulse to seize the sight and word is the poetic inspiration, and the touch of that power superior to the normal makes for that excitement of brain and nerve which the poet feels when there is an inrush of influence. And here I'm quoting some lines from Sri Aurobindo. He writes, and I quote, "The voice of poetry comes from a region above us, a plane of our being above and beyond our personal intelligence, a supermind which sees things in their innermost and largest truth by a spiritual identity and with a lustrous effulgency and rapture, and its native language is a revelatory, inspired, intuitive word, limpid or subtly vibrant, or densely packed with the glory of this ecstasy and luster." Unquote. In fact, according to the Vedic theory also, the source of the inspired word is the home of truth. It's a native level of a superior self which holds the knowledge which is hidden from the normal intelligence. But it does not come to the poet unaltered and in an absolute way. The inmost truth, the luminous word and speech, is covered by what Sri Aurobindo terms a cloud of formless luster. But the poet has to receive that and reshape the word and substance with the mental powers, while the mind is still in possession of the inspiration and enlightened by the superior influence. The word that comes from the levels above the mind first enters the intuitive depths to emerge and be reshaped by the poetic intelligence. Sri Aurobindo says the intuitive self of our sense, life, heart, and mind is the transmitting agent. There is a subliminal power hidden within us which is partially transparent, and the less near we are to this transmitting agent, the more intellectualized is the tone and substance of poetry. Evidently, the more directly we can be in touch with this power, the more intuitive will be the poetic utterance. The more direct the transmission, greater will be the force of inspiration and revelation, and we can bring down the absolute and inevitable word from the supramental level. For this to be accomplished in proper measure, there has to be a change in the manner and method of future poetry. This will include the raising of the adequate and dynamic levels of speech to the intuitive and illuminative levels, or the power of these higher levels must touch or penetrate the lower degrees of poetic speech. And it is not enough that the potent, inevitable word intervene occasionally or rarely. What is needed is the greater generalizing of the purely intuitive degree. The future poet may begin from the clear and strong and delicate poetical adequacy, like the older poets, or he may take the dynamic eloquence or make use of the imaginatively effective power of language and make common the utterances which could earlier be effected only in moments of greater elevation. The intellectual tone and color has to be discharged also in order to arrive at the pure intuitive expression of thought and feeling, or of the intuitive vital vision, or a subtler psychic or spiritualized intelligence. This kind of language can affect the identity between the mind's intuitive thought and more than the surface truth of the objects and experiences. But sometimes the subtler suggestion of rhythm and music also brings this about, when the sound does the work of transfiguration instead of the expression which is not strong enough to carry the intuitive vision. Sri Aurobindo says some work along these lines have already begun, but much, much more needs to be done to effectuate the complete change. And this is a period of an uncertain transition and which must be followed by a great and full transformation, when the mold and manner and spirit of poetic expression also will be recast and reshaped to suit the surge of self seeing and thinking of the live soul of man. But the most interesting and unique feature of this change will be its universality. It shall be restricted not to a single race or nation, but it will be done in many languages by minds of many nation entities at once, Sri Aurobindo says. The future is of multitudinous vastitudes and finer subtleties and transparencies of the seeing and thinking of the inmost self in man, in touch with the opening truths of all levels of his experience. And future poetry has to include, accommodate, and express all that. We do have voices expressing something of this change, but these are yet immature and sound strange and express the not yet universally accepted subtleties or come with the new speech and rhythm but poverty of substance. All these are incipient efforts yet, but point to the future when there shall be a fuller and completer revelation of the unfolding spirit. And all that needs to be done to open the doors of our intuitive self has not yet been done successfully by the poetic speech. The future poetry may accomplish this undone or half done task. And Sri Aurobindo says, and I'm quoting his lines, the speech also has to be found that shall come by the rending or removal of the golden lid between our intelligence and the effulgent supra intelligence, and effect a direct and sovereign descent and pouring of some absolute sight and word of the spirit into the molds of human language. Unquote. So, like the evolution of consciousness, the journey of poetry too shall be from the intellect to the supra intelligence, and thoughts of the intellectual mind shall more and more be replaced by the words of the spirit. And of course, to that we really look forward. Thank you so much.